days ago in Moscow when he was celebrating his name day, the memory of Saint Cyril and Methodius, and so he was happy that the tradition of having Sourozh conferences in our diocese is alive, that people are flocking to the conference, that very prominent speakers are invited, and so his greetings and the greetings of the newly appointed Exarch of the Western Europe, who was elevated yesterday to the status of Metropolitan of Corson and Western Europe, but whom you very well know as former Bishop Anthony of Bogorodisk, who was here at this very hall a few years ago. He is now not only in charge of the department of the parishes abroad, but also he is the Exarch of Western Europe and with direct responsibility about France, Switzerland and Italy. And so he may be one day here with us again, and in fact he was invited, as well as Metropolitan Hilarion, Metropolitan Mark of Ryazan, and Bishop Irenei, and his Beatitude Metropolitan Deacon of America and Canada, but due to different reasons all of them were unable to come and join our conference, but all of them sent their warmest greetings to the conference, and I'm very happy to give the blessing to begin our main day of talks with the blessing of His Holiness the Patriarch and all the hierarchs invited to our conference, whom we hope to see here one year or another. And now I would like to ask Father Joseph to introduce our first speaker today, whom you also very well know, but Father Joseph will say a few words about him.
Our first speaker today is Father Andrew Louth, otherwise known as the Reverend Dr. Professor, Professor now Emeritus of Durham University. Father Andrew always reminds me of the phrase of the Lord, prophet is not without honor except in his own country, because we know Father Andrew's dear friend, our priest in Durham, whom we meet year by year at the conferences, with whom we have a very pleasant conversation in the bar afterwards. But actually Father Andrew, and I hope I won't embarrass him by saying this, is what we might call an A-list Orthodox theologian, with a very distinguished and long academic career, author of many books, many papers, someone with whom we don't realize how blessed we are to have him present at our conferences. But he can, because he is so modest, he can easily pass under notice in this respect. But really, it's very good, and we are very happy that we have him to present. He has a remarkable quality to combining high academic learning with a wonderful manner. For example, we had a very interesting conversation last night about a conference he attended recently on the very topical subject of autocephaly. And it turns out that actually there is no clearly defined concept of what that is, and so much of the discourse around this subject is very heated and without firm theological or canonical foundation. And Father Andrew is quite capable of telling you that in the nicest possible way. But anyway, that's not his subject for today, although perhaps another time when things are calmer. Today, Father Andrew is going to speak about folly for Christ, which, of course, always has to be distinguished from folly, just as folly. Not always easy to tell the difference. So, Father Andrew Foley, for the sake of Christ, from Byzantium to Russia.
Fathers, brothers and sisters, friends, thank you very much for your kind words, Father. As I came in, I had this thrust into my hand. So I thought I'd use the opportunity to publicise this. This is a book by Martin Dudley, who's there, who's been Orthodox for about 2 years, and it's called Being Orthodox, or as some of us rather irreverently call it, Being Orthodox for 5 minutes. And it said on the outside, it says, pre-order now and get 20% off. So I recommend that. So, the subject, Folly for Christ, from Byzantium to Russia. I sometimes think, reading the ascetic fathers, that had they known of the game of snakes and ladders, they would have eagerly used it as an illustration for the spiritual life. In a way, perhaps they did, only they called it snakes and ladders. Sorry, they called it ladders and demons. Think of that wonderful icon of the ladder of St. John of Sinai, Klimakos, Yesvichnik. With the ladder reaching up to Christ, welcoming those who have made it, with demons attacking the ascending monks with spears and hooks, and dragging them off the ladder into the fiery abyss. But my point about snakes and ladders is this. When you get to the top row, if you can remember when you played it in your youth, or perhaps with your children, when you get to the top row, and are approaching the final square, you face lots of snakes that will take you back, so you have to start all over again. And indeed, usually, if my memory serves me right, but it's a very long time since I played it, on the last square, or the next to the last square, there's a very long snake that takes you back almost to the beginning. And there is something like that in accounts in the desert, in accounts of the ascetic fathers of the spiritual life. The more advanced you get, the more you are finding prayer coming almost naturally, the more your sense of God's presence seems very close. Then it is, they say, that you face the most deadly temptation. The temptation of thinking that you've made it, that you are a successful ascetic, that you now have achieved real engratia, real control over yourself. And the temptation is to accept, the temptation is to accept this account of how far you've progressed in the spiritual life, to accept that you've made it, to congratulate yourself on your success. And that, the fathers say, is the suggestion of the demon of vain glory, kenodoxia, literally empty glory. That, of course, is the meaning of vain. Once you succumb to that, you are lost. You have no defense against any of the demons, not even the demon of sexual temptation. And tempted by that, something the monk thought he had conquered long ago, the monk does not just fall as he enjoys his imaginations or worse, but he despairs. What? All this struggle and asceticism, all for nothing. I'm back at the beginning. Many of the writings of the ascetic fathers, especially Evagrius, whose wisdom was so prized that even after he was condemned at the Fifth Ecumenical Synod, his works were preserved one way or another in the Byzantine monastic tradition. Many of these writings are primarily intended for solitaries, hermits, though in reality most monks at any time were probably living in community as cenobites, sharing in life in common, the kinos vios. Evagrius tells us very early on in his popular work, The Monk, or the Logos Practicos, that it is the solitary who really struggles with the demons. Naked struggle, as he calls it. For with monks living in community, the demons can rely on the other monks to do their work for them. And that applies even more to those of us who are not monks. It is through living with others that we encounter day by day, at home, at work, wherever, that the demons seize their opportunity, and indeed, through our own negligence and lack of watchfulness, use us, each one of us, to attack those with whom we live. Vainglory for the solitary comes from his own self-satisfied sense of himself. For those who live with other people, the communities are legion, the opportunities are legion, a word of praise, a word of appreciation for what we do, how helpful we have been. All of this is fuel for the temptation of vainglory that will destroy anything we think we have achieved in the ascetic, in the spiritual life. But what are we to do? Be hopeless so that no one will ever praise us for anything? No, that can't be right. But what then? And it is here, it seems to me, that the tradition of the Holy Fool emerges in Christian history, and in particular the history of Cenobitic monasticism. All the early stories seem to fit into this precise context. The earliest occurs in Palladius' Lausiac history, a kind of travelogue of his visit at the turn of the 4th century to the monks of Egypt, primarily, though he also visited Palestine and Syria. There he tells the story of an unnamed nun, later tradition called her Isidora, who pretended madness and possession, the Greeks moriake dema. The other nuns felt such contempt for her that they never ate with her, which suited her well. She worked in the kitchen, doing all the most menial jobs, fulfilling, as Palladius put it, what is written. If anyone among you seem to be wise in this world, let him become a fool that he may be wise. She is a fool for Christ. Instead of the proper nun's cowl, she wore a rag around her head. No one ever saw her eating. She just wiped the crumbs from the table and scoured out the pots and made do with that. She was never angry with anyone, nor grumbled, nor answered back, even though she was maltreated, insulted, cursed, and loathed. One day, so Palladius' story goes, an angel appeared to an eminent hermit, an ascetic, Piterum, who lived on Mount Porphyrites, which boasted many hermits, who said to him, "Why do you think so much of yourself for being pious and living in a place like this? Do you want to see someone more pious than yourself, a woman? Go to the women's monastery at Tavanesi, and there you will find one with a band on her head. She is better than you are. While being cuffed about by such a crowd, she has never taken her heart off God, but you dwell here and wander about cities in your mind." So St. Piterum sets off and gains admission to the women's monastery. He needs permission, which he gets readily enough. And there he insists on seeing all the nuns. And they all turn up for the famous hermit, but he says, no, there's someone else missing. Bring her to me too. And the nuns reply, we have one inside the kitchen who is touched. I'm using the standard translation, Thomas Meyer's translation. That is what they call the afflicted ones. Piterum tells them to go and get her. So they set off and call her, but she makes no response. And in the end, the nun seize her by force, telling her, the holy Piterum wants to see you, for he was renowned, onomastos, Palladius comments. She's dragged into the presence of the hermit. He sees the rag on her head, and he goes down on his knees, saying, bless me. And she too falls down at his feet, saying, bless me, Lord. And the nuns are amazed at this and say to Piterum, don't let her insult you, she's touched. Piterum then addresses the nuns and tells them this, you are the ones who are touched. This woman is your spiritual mother, or amas, and mine. And Palladius comments on the word amas, so they call them spiritually. And I pray, Piterum goes on, I pray that I may be as worthy as she on the day of judgment. The nuns all fall down at Piterum's feet and confess the ways in which they have abused and insulted this woman, poured the leavings of a plate over her head, beaten her with their fists, punched her nose, and so on. So Piterum leaves, and now the nuns honour and praise this woman and apologise for their behaviour. But all this is too much for the poor woman, and after a few days she left the monastery. Where she went and where she disappeared to, or how she died, nobody knows. It's a remarkable account, and the central point is, as I suggested in my preamble, that the fool is someone who adopts this pose to avoid being praised by others. She is simply despised and taken for granted and worse, but this is something she has chosen. Once she finds herself praised and honoured, it's all too much. She slips away. The holy Piterum fits this picture too. The angel tells him that he makes too much of himself as a renowned hermit. If he wants to see real sanctity, he should go to this woman's monastery and find someone who, however she is treated, never takes her heart from God. Unlike you, Pithrum, who wander around cities in your mind. What a wonderful expression for the sort of things we often do when we're praying, wandering around cities in our mind. The account is remarkable for a couple of particular ways, though. Here comes the scholar that you mentioned. Twice in that very short account, Palladius comments on a word he has used. First, Sali. The nuns say this woman is touched. She's Sali. Translated touched. It's the feminine of Salos, the word that comes to be the regular term for a holy fool. And secondly, Amas, the feminine form of Avas, which we usually encounter in the vocative, Abba or Ava and Amma. And in both cases, Palladius adds a comment explaining the word. With Sali, that is what they call the afflicted ones. With Amas, so they call them spiritually. The reason being, I suppose, that both these words are unusual. Palladius adds a comment for the sake of the reader. Actually, in both cases, their use in this chapter of the Lorziac history, of either Salos or Amas, it seems to be the earliest we have. As I remarked, Salos becomes the normal word for a holy fool. We have no idea what it comes from, what it originally meant. There are lots of guesses, but none of them make sense. Though clearly it is both close in meaning to the usual word for a fool, which is moros, which is the common word meaning foolish, stupid, but also quite distinct from it. Palladius begins his account by quoting the Apostle Paul, "If anyone among you seems to be wise in this world, let him be a fool, that he may become wise." 1 Corinthians 3:18. Which goes on to say that the wisdom of this world is foolishness before God, and picks up what Paul had said earlier on in the epistle about God's choosing the foolish things of this world, tamorah, the ignoble, even that which doesn't exist down yonder. One way in which the Salos differs from the Moros is that the one who adopts the role of Salos is taking a pose. The woman in the account we're looking at is introduced by Palladius as Ipokranimeni Morianke Demona, pretending to be mad and possessed. She wasn't at all, but saw that the pretense would deflect any recognition of her worth, a recognition that could be spiritually dangerous to her. In the same sort of context, only a little later in the 5th century, we find another example of a Salos, the cook, also in the kitchen, Evrosinos. His Vita, his saint's life, says that they despised him as a simpleton and only trusted him to do the cooking. He performed many secret deeds of virtue, but people saw him only when he was dirty after his cooking and in shabby clothes. Covered in soot, as if in opulent clothing, he was hourly subjected to public scolding and taunting. Everybody despised him for everything he did. It was as if he was an obnoxious abomination. Sometimes they would thrash him and call him a useless slave, and they would wear him down with hunger and thirst. Yet every day he noted down how he profited from remarkable benefits, by which he meant precisely the abuse meted out to him by all, for he took it as praise. Then one day, the elder of the monastery had a dream of heaven, where, to his great surprise, he met Evrosinos, who was working there as in heaven, as a watchman, whereas the elder had spent 3 years of ceaseless spiritual labours to get there at all. When asked, Evrosinos gives him 3 paradise apples, which the elder finds in his cell when he wakes up. And seeing them, he rushes off to the monastery and tells his monks, "Pray, in our monastery we have a precious pearl, Evrosinos. We despised him as an ignoramus, but he is deemed more worthy of God's grace than any of us." As Evrosinos hears this, he opened a side door and went out of the church, and to this day he has not shown himself, for he shunned earthly praise. Another account of the same monk has him being called, and indeed calling himself, Salos, a fool. This is where the notion of the Sourozh begins, as a counter to the temptation to vainglory, kenodoxia, in a monastery. These sali are not so much presented as examples, but rather as a warning to monks and indeed to anyone who seriously embarks on the spiritual life, of the dangers of making that pursuit some kind of achievement, recognised by oneself, or worse, by others, even in a way of the ambivalence of seeking, even in a way of the ambivalence of seeking to be virtuous. It's worth commenting in this context that what is on one level the supreme Christian virtue, humility, is not a goal that we can set ourselves. It's not some kind of spiritual achievement. It is a direct contradiction to say, to be proud of being humble. And it's a contradiction that often entangles us. The beginnings of the Christian history of the notion of the Sourozh, the fool for Christ, has to do with recognizing this paradox. The Sourozh avoids anything in which he might take pride, any sense of holiness as an achievement. Now these are the beginnings. In succeeding centuries, the notion of the Sourozh develops, and we shall now look at that development. One who can be regarded as the archetype of the Byzantine Sourozh is St. Simeon the Fool, of whom we read in the church history written by the 6th century historian Evagrius, not to be confused with the 4th century monk whom we already mentioned. In chapter 34 of Book 4, which is concerned with, Book 4 itself is concerned with various events and people in the reigns of the Emperor Justin I and his nephew Justinian the Great, that is with the period 518 to 65, there's a brief account of Simeon of Emesa, who is introduced as a man who shed the robe of vanity to such an extent that to those who did not know he even appeared to be demented, although he was indeed filled with all sacred wisdom and grace. Evagrius says that for the most part he kept himself to himself, not allowing anyone to know how he propitiated the divine, as he puts it in sort of classical Greek, how he prayed, he means, how he fasted or ate. That there were times when in public he seemed estranged from normality, to be completely devoid of sense and intelligence. Sometimes in taverns he would display total gluttony, eating everything that there was. If anyone treated him with reverence, he would rush out in a rage, afraid that his own special virtue might be discovered. Evagrius then tells us 3 stories about Simeon. The first concerned a young servant girl who had become pregnant as a result of rape. Her masters insisted on her revealing the culprit, and she falsely named Simeon. Simeon did nothing to defend himself, saying that he bore that fallible thing, the flesh, and withdrew, appearing to be deeply ashamed. When the girl came to give birth, she went into a difficult and painful labour. The baby wouldn't come. Simeon had come along, and they asked for his prayers, but he said that she would not give birth unless she revealed the child's true father. On revealing the true father, of course, wasn't Simeon, she gave birth. The truth acting as midwife, as Evagrius puts it. The second story concerns Simeon's relation with a prostitute, with whom he had spent a long time one afternoon. Suspicion of Simeon grew to such an extent that onlookers asked for an explanation from the woman, and she revealed that Simeon had brought her food and drink, for she had had nothing for 3 days, and stayed with her while she ate and drank. The third story concerns an event that took place before an earthquake in the region of Beirut. Simeon, with a whip in his hand, struck most of the columns in the forum, saying, "Stand, you can dance." Bystanders made a note of the pillars that he had passed without striking. When the earthquake struck a few days later, all these pillars did indeed fall down. The ones he hadn't struck. The ones who didn't say, "Stand, you can dance." There are parallels to all these stories in early monastic literature, in Pleiades' Lausiac history, in the Apothegmata Patrum, the sayings of the Desert Fathers, or in John Moskos' Spiritual Meadow. The story about Simeon's being accused of making a woman pregnant is paralleled in the very first story in the Apothegmata, associated in the chapter on Macarius the Great, for example. The first two stories about Simeon are about his accepting an accusation of fornication or consulting with a prostitute, whereas the reality was very different. John of the Ladder, the person I already mentioned, writing somewhat later, has this to say in the 25th chapter of his Ladder, the run, the step as it's usually called, but I think ladders have rungs rather than steps, on humility. If the definition, the meaning, and the manner of extreme pride consists in one making a show of virtues he does not possess for the sake of glory, then the token of deepest humility is to pretend to shabby behaviour that is not really ours. The clairvoyance manifested in the third of the stories that Evagrius tells, combined with the extravagant way of expressing it, is another trait of Simeon that we shall find developed further on. That is, in the life of St. Simeon the Fool, written by Leontius, Bishop of Neapolis, modern Limassol, or at least nearby, in the 7th century. Leontius based himself on Evagrius' exiguous information, either supplanting it with oral tradition, or possibly just embroidering it, and composed a more detailed life of the saint. Evagrius' account is about a page and a half long. The life of Simeon is about 70 pages. Leontius places St. Simeon's birthplace in Edessa, the Blessed City, modern Urfa in southern Turkey, one of the centres of Syriac Christianity. At the age of 20, Simeon went with his widowed mother on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. There he met another young man from Syria, John by name, with whom he quickly became friends. John had recently been married and was on pilgrimage there with his wife and with his parents. After visiting the shrines, they all set off back to Edessa together. When they got down to the Dead Sea, whence they could see the monasteries on the far side of the Jordan, John, whose initiative it was, and Simeon, had a sudden impulse to leave their party and make their way over to the monasteries, there to practice together the monastic life. Leontius' life makes it clear, emphasises, that strongly the pull was to the monastic life, nevertheless they both felt strongly the ties they already had. Simeon to his mother, John to his young and wealthy wife and to his parents. And only with the counsel of a monk that they met, Nikon, were they able to embrace the monastic life. A couple of days after tonsure, they left the monastery together and lived as voski, or grazers, living on the edge of the desert in a deserted cell. The voski were sort of monks who didn't actually belong to monasteries, but wandered around and like cattle and nourished themselves with what they could find on the edge of the desert. Wore very little or nothing. And it was this extreme form of monasticism that Simeon and John embraced. Spending long periods of time in prayer, each alone, but near enough to seek the other for comfort, if smitten by the demon of Axidy, boredom. After 31 years, Simeon suddenly said to John, "What profit is it for us, brother, to spend our days here in the desert? But if you will hearken to me, arise, let us go and save others as well." Dismayed at this proposal, John tried to dissuade Simeon, but Simeon was adamant. "Believe me," Simeon says, "for my part, I am not going to stay here, but by the power of Christ, I am going to mock the world." John repeated his plea for Simeon not to abandon the desert and himself. "I beg you in the Lord's name, dear brother, do not abandon me in my wretchedness, for I have not reached so high a level as this, as to be able to mock the world. But for the sake of Christ who joined us together, do not seek to be separated from your brother. You know that apart from God, I have no one except you, my brother." John also warned Simeon that this sudden impulse to go back to the world to mock could be a deception by the devil. All to no avail. Simeon left John in the desert, and so they parted from one another, both of them weeping bitterly. So Simeon set off on the final stage of his life. By this time he must have been about 50. First he visited Jerusalem again as a pilgrim and prayed there, that what he did might remain hidden until his departure from this life, so that he would escape the glory from men that leads to pride and conceit. As a fool for Christ, feigning madness to avoid being honoured as a holy man, Simeon made his way back to Emesa, modern Homs, in Syria. He entered Emesa with a certain swagger. Finding a dead dog on a rubbish tip outside the city, he untied his belt, attached one end to the dog's leg, and dragged him after him as he ran into the city. Children from the nearby school shouted out, "Hey, a mad monk!" And they ran after him, taunting him and even hitting him. Next day he went into church for the liturgy, cracking nuts and putting out the lamps. Then, to escape the people who were trying to drive him out of the church, he went up into the pulpit and pelted women with walnuts. Eventually, he was bundled out of the church and on the way overturned the stalls of the pastry sellers on the way, who beat him up so severely that he nearly died. That was the beginning. He continued with his absurd and shameless actions. During Holy Week, for instance, he ate meat in public. Normally didn't eat anything in public, but Holy Week he ate meat in public. Given a job looking after a refreshment stall, he distributed it all free to the poor. In public during the day, he hopped and jumped in the streets, tripping people up and pretending to be an epileptic. Given another job in a tavern, one day he went up to the room of the innkeeper's wife who was asleep alone and made out as if he was going to undress, to the fury of the innkeeper who came in at that moment. He found another friend in Emesa called John, a deacon, who on one occasion suggested that they went to the baths to wash, whereupon, laughing, Simeon took off all his clothes, wrapped them around his head like a turban, and rushed straight into the women's part of the baths. We hear a lot of Simeon's laughter, of games and playing. There is a disconcerting, childish joyfulness about Simeon's behaviour. He seeks out the company of the outcasts of society, the despised and the rejected. He spent time in taverns, made friends with actors and actresses, not in the least an honourable profession in the ancient world, and with prostitutes. His behaviour was outrageous, and the respectable were outraged. But alongside this outrageous public life, apparently so compromised and compromising, if not outright immoral and irreligious, Simeon had another side. For the madness was opposed that both deprived him of any worldly respect, but also brought him close to the despised and the rejected and the poor, who treated him not just with amused tolerance, but sometimes with genuine friendship. The other side was the night. During the night, hours were spent in prayer and in conversation with his other John, the deacon. Even if he spoke nonsense in public, with John he was coherent and serious. And the prayer. In hidden places known only to John, he devoted hours and hours of his night to prayer. Even in public, though he upset people and caused outrage, he was no heretic. He did not attack the teaching of the church, nor did he actually behave immorally. He received holy gifts and communion, even if on one occasion he did pelt people with walnuts from the pulpit. One might say that he was not concerned with morality, with the risk of moralism and all the risks that entails, risks of pride in one's own moral achievement, and the risk of respectability that shields one from the less fortunate, as well as the risk of setting oneself above others who don't, we think, measure up to our own wonderful standards. Several reasons are given for Simeon's adoption of holy folly. There are the reasons, for instance, that Simeon gives to his friend and brother monk, John, the other John, the first John. It's interesting they're both called John. It's not enough to save ourselves, we need to do something to save others, he said to John. And alongside this, his purpose of going into the world to mock the world. These don't seem to me to be entirely separate. As a solitary in the desert, he had put the world at a distance. And anybody who reads about early monasticism, or read monasticism in any period, one of the things is that the monk leaves the world. He renounces the world. He undergoes what the Greeks call apotagi, which is usually translated renunciation. The really means putting the world at a distance, putting a distance between yourself and the world. Lots of different ways of doing it in the early church. You go out into a desert, you put yourself behind the wall of a monastery, or you could climb up a pillar. These are all ways of putting the world at a distance. Partly to avoid the temptations the world offers, and this John felt very strongly. He felt he couldn't follow Simeon because he couldn't trust himself amid the distractions of the world. But also for the sake of the world, through intercession first of all. Simeon is not content to live completely apart from the world. He needs to go and save others as well. But he still needs to preserve his apotagi, his renunciation of the world, a renunciation laid on him not just by his monastic profession, but by his baptismal profession as a Christian. And this he does by pretending to madness, by behaving as if mad, quite outrageously. And this he does in the world, but not in private, whether alone or with his friend John the deacon. He does not himself enter into madness. That would be something else, distinct from the madness of the Byzantine fool, but uses the appearance of madness, reckless abandonment of respectability, to prevent the world getting at him in its usual ways, by honouring him as a holy man or as a saint. How does he actually save others? If his madness cuts him off from the respectable, it provides him with a kind of common ground with those who are not respectable. The poor, the despised, the rejected, including criminals and the immoral. The Son of Man came to seek and save that which was lost. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. These words of the Lord about himself and his mission come naturally to mind, I think, as we think of Simeon's behaviour. Also his attitude towards the woman who was a sinner, a prostitute, when he was dining with Simon the Pharisee. Therefore I tell you, her sins, which were many, have been forgiven, for she loved much. And then also the nights spent in prayer, both by Simeon and our Lord. One word used by Leontius in connection with Simeon's behaviour is sympathia, for which sympathy is far too weak a translation. It means something more like the Latin compassion, suffering with others, alongside others. And paradoxically, it seems to me, that sympathia, suffering with others, is made possible because of his apathia, dispassion, as is usually translated. Apathia, the goal of the ascetic life, the monastic life, throughout the Byzantine tradition. For there is no suggestion that for all Simeon sharing the company of prostitutes, he ever engaged in sexual activity. On the contrary, when he went naked into the women's baths, he was asked by John the deacon how he had felt among all those naked women. And he replied, like a block of wood, and among other blocks of wood. That was how I felt then. I wasn't conscious of having a body or being among other bodies, but my intellect was wholly occupied with the work of God and never departed from him. In a paradoxical way, Simeon's apathia makes possible his sympathia. Because of his own indifference to passionate feeling through his communion with God in prayer, the intellect, the nous, is in the Byzantine ascetic vocabulary an organ not so much of thinking as of prayer. He is able to exercise true sympathy with others, a true fellow feeling that doesn't want anything from the other, but can support others. To use the modern expression, he can just be there for others through shared communion, koinonia. Sympathia, koinonia, these are the ways in which we save others. These are about reaching the real humanity of those with whom we live and for whom we care, which is something much deeper than notching up converts. My final fool for Christ is St. Andrew the Fool, and with him we're beginning to cross from Byzantium to Russia. St. Andrew was himself thoroughly Byzantine, though indeed somewhat fictional. His vita or life is a good deal later than the period in which it places Andrew, and that placing Andrew in history is somewhat conjectural. But it was this life of Andrew that was early translated into Slavonic, making it the real introduction to the Slavs of the Fool for Christ. Then at a literary level. The conjectural historical setting of Andrew seems to be the 6th century, and the early 6th century. For throughout the life, Andrew has a fool, has a companion, one Epiphanius, as Simeon had a companion, John. And in both these lives, this companion is quite important. He's the person who knows the truth about the Fool for Christ. Everybody else only sees the mask. Epiphanius, of whom he predicts, at one point in the life, that he will become Patriarch of Constantinople. There's only been one Patriarch of Constantinople called Epiphanius, and he was Patriarch from 520 to 535. The end of Justinian's reign at the end of Justin's reign at the beginning of Justinian's reign. The author of the life was one Nicephorus, who lived in the 10th century, but he makes out that he simply discovered and published a life written in the 6th century by one Nicephorus, who was a priest of the great church of Hagia Sophia. Alas, this Nicephorus didn't have the resources of modern scholarship and didn't know that Nicephorus is in fact a late Byzantine name, pretty well unknown in early Byzantium. So it's not likely to be a Nicephorus, not likely to be a Nicephorus who was the priest of the great church in the 6th century. And indeed the Vita itself gives the lie to such pretension, as it's filled with material, notably the journeys through the heavens, that are much more characteristic of 10th century rather than 6th century texts. Epiphanius himself may be pretty fictional too. We know very little about him. And though, well, both saying, he may be fictional because we know very little about him, so a very safe person to sort of put into your history. If there's we don't know anything about him, somebody can't come along and say, no, he didn't do that. But though there's nothing odd about someone in the 10th century presenting his Andrew the Fool as follows. This way, I think I've missed something out here. Yeah, so I'll rephrase it. The other thing about the life of St. Anthony the Fool is it's clearly based on the life of Simeon the Fool. That's the model for the life. Expanded vastly. I mean, it's about 3 times the size of the life of Simeon. And though there's nothing odd about somebody in the 10th century presenting his Andrew the Fool as following the steps of Simeon the Fool, it could hardly be Andrew's own intention, because Simeon is more mid than early 6th century, nor could it have been said by the supposed 6th century author of the supposed discovered Vita. For the Vita of Simeon, on which the Vita of Andrew is based, was written by Leontius of Neapolis, who can certainly be dated to the early mid-7th century. In short, what we have in the life of St. Andrew the Fool is a magnificent evocation of the Byzantine ideal of the Holy Fool, somewhat embroidered by the kind of things that people were interested in the 10th century, particularly the afterlife, trips, visions, as it were, into the heavens and so on. It's long, as I said, about 3 times the length of the life of St. Simeon, but evidently based on it. Episodes from that life being copied and developed, to which are added much lengthier accounts of Andrew's nighttime prayer, in which, for instance, he levitates, and as I said, even from time to time, he's taken on night journeys to the heavens, sometimes in the company of Epiphanius, who at the time of his association with Andrew seemed suspiciously like the kind of courtier cleric from whose ranks bishops and patriarchs were chosen in the 10th century. But he's certainly not yet ascended the patriarchal throne, so if we're going to take it chronologically seriously, the whole of most of Andrew's life belongs before 520. Also, he engages in serious discussions, mostly a sort of set pattern of questions and answers. Epiphanius asks some questions, and Andrew gives generally rather long answers, which was a very, by this sort of 7th, 8th century, a very common form of monastic literature. And in these discussions, he sheds his apparent madness and is not only lucid but full of genuine insight. Now, to embark on any serious discussion of Andrew as he appears in his Vita is something I should have embarked on much earlier on in this lecture. It's nearly 10 o'clock. Had I intended to do so. I said, as I introduced St. Andrew the Fool, that his Vita was much prized among the Slavs. And there's one striking illustration of this. For Andrew the Fool is associated intimately with the feast of the Pokrov, the feast of the veil or protection of the Mother of God, observed on the 1st of October. In the life of St. Andrew, there is an episode in which the Mother of God appears both to Epiphanius and to St. Andrew. And I'll quote a bit from it. During the sleepless doxology, that's a literal translation of the Greek, I imagine it means all-night doxology, held in the holy casket of the chapel of Lacheni, the Blessed Andrew was there, behaving in his usual way, and always behaving rather badly. Epiphanius was there too, with one of his servants, which makes the point that Epiphanius was an upper-class bloke with servants. When he was already the 4th hour of the night, that's a bit before midnight, he saw the Most Holy Mother of God appearing in full sight, very tall, from the royal doors, that is, the central doors that led from the narthex into the nave, escorted by an awe-inspiring retinue, in which there were, among others, the venerable Forerunner and the Son of Thunder, the two Johns, I think it means, holding her by the hand on both sides. As she approached the ambo, the Blessed Man went up to Epiphanius and said, "Do you see the Lady and Mistress of the world?" And he answered, "Yes, my spiritual father." And before their eyes she knelt and prayed for a long while, besprinkling with tears her godlike and holy immaculate face. Having finished her prayer, she went into the sanctuary. With her beautiful dignity, she removed her veil, her naphorion, which appeared like a flash of lightning from her holy immaculate head, and took it was large and inspiring, in her holy immaculate hands, and spread it over the people standing there. For a long time, the admirable men saw it stretched out over the people, radiating the glory of the Lord like amber. As long as the Most Holy Mother of God was there, the veil was also visible, but when she had withdrawn, they could no longer see it. No doubt she had taken it away with her, but her favour she left to those who were there. It's just an episode. In fact, all the chapters in the life of St. Andrew were episodes. There's no narrative line. Just each chapter tells you something. There's no context, no historical context. There are a couple of hundred lines further on, Andrew foresees the fall of the city and the desecration of the great church, which the editor suggests are the reason for the tears of the Mother of God. That again, I think, puts it, we're in the 10th century, not in the 6th. However, that may be, this episode was received, especially among the Rus, as a confirmation of the care of the Mother of God for those who seek her protection. Her favour she left for those who were there. And the feast of the protection veil Bakrov, which Grand Prince Andrei Bogolyutsky introduced in Vladimir in the second half of the 12th century. Does that make sense? It doesn't make. The witch shouldn't be there. And so the feast of the Pokrov is a Russian or a Slav feast. It's not a Greek feast. The Greeks took it over later. Why? I'm not interested in the moment. That is as far as I'm taking you. Most of the rest of the lectures of this weekend are concerned with the continuation of this tradition of the Byzantine fool in the Slav world, a continuation which has its own distinctiveness. What are we to make of the Holy Fool? I leave you two quotations from others. The first, from the Russian historian George Fyodorov. We are so accustomed to the paradox of Christianity that we hardly see in the tremendous words of Paul anything but a rhetorical exaggeration. But Paul insists here on the radical irreconcilability of the two orders, that of the world and that of God. In the kingdom of God reigns a complete inversion of our earthly values. The wisdom of this world is foolishness with God, and vice versa. The foolishness of God is wiser than men's. These are deep and dangerous words. And this from the modern Greek philosopher and theologian Christos Yanaras. In the case of the fools of Christ, certainly their shocking freedom from every law, rule, restriction and code of obligation is not simply didactic in its purpose, reminding us of the danger of identifying virtue and holiness with conventional social decorum and egocentric moral rectitude. No one can ever really teach simply by calling in question mistaken conceptions and ways of life. One has to make the fullness of the saving truth incarnate in oneself. The shocking freedom of the fools is first and foremost a total death, a complete mortification of every individual element in their lives. This death is the freedom which can break and destroy every conventional form. It is resurrection into a life of personal distinctiveness, a life of love which knows neither bounds nor barriers. Thank you.